What is up, all my financial freedom defenders? You are here with Dean Diaz for another episode of Defending Your Finances. In a world full of information, we deliver the unbridled truth about investments and financial planning that you won't get anywhere else. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or Google Play, where we'll be delivering to you a show every Monday and Friday. You can also visit us at our website at www.diligentandsteadfast.com to learn more about who we are, what we do, and to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So, lately I've had a lot of people asking me, Dean, what is with this cryptocurrency stuff? What is with this Bitcoin stuff? What does all this mean? What does it do? I don't understand how it works. And if you're asking those same questions, trust me, you are not alone. There are many, many people who have heard of it, they've read about it, and they still don't get what this Bitcoin or Litecoin or Ripple or what these things do and how they work and what they're all about. So I wanted to come right out and address these concerns or these questions. And I thought to myself, what is it that I could do to provide to my listeners and my clients and those people who are just seeking out the truth. There's a lot of people out there that just want direction. And in a world we're just inundated and bombarded with information left and right, front and center, regardless of whether or not it's truth or lies. There's just information everywhere. And so I was thinking about how to really kind of create some content for you all that was really going to help address some of these questions and concerns. And I couldn't do it without really going back and revisiting where we've been as a nation, where our currency came from, and how all of this plays into this whole Bitcoin and cryptocurrency mania. So I wanted to make this podcast, but then as I got into it, I realized this is going to be a long one if it's just one episode. So this is going to be a two-part podcast where we're addressing the history of our money, the value of the paper in your pocket, and what that means for Bitcoin and Litecoin and all these other cryptocurrencies. So buckle up, here we go. We're taking a trip down memory lane, and I'm going to hit you with some history that you might have never heard of before. So listen up, take note, and enjoy the truth, because all I'm doing is delivering the truth. This is 100% objective information, unbridled truth to get you the most important and the most impacting pieces of information so that you can make the best decisions with your hard-earned dollars. Okay, so anyway, let's start it right off. Let's kick it off going back to 1792, long time ago. We had passed, the founders of this nation passed the Coinage Act, which was an act that was written April 2nd, 1792. That's my dyslexia kicking in. Dollars are to contain 371 grams of pure silver, or 416 grams of standard silver. Half dollars are to be 1/2 of that value of that dollar and contain 185 grams of pure silver, or 208 grams of standard silver. Likewise, quarter dollars or quarters are supposed to be 1/4 of the value of that dollar and contain 92 grams of pure silver, or 104 grams of standard silver. Dimes, what we know today as a dime or 1/10 of a dollar, is to contain 37 grams of pure silver, or 41 grams of standard silver. And finally, half dimes, which they were known back then. Today they're known as nickels. And those were to contain 18 grams of pure silver, or 20 grams of standard silver, and be 1/20th of a dollar. So the Coinage Act, which was an act that was written by the founding fathers of this country, and it was really written for the to really define what our monetary system was supposed to look like. And of course, they really had this revolving around silver, and to have our monetary system based on something tangible, something that we can see, feel, touch. and for those weirdos out there, even taste. Now, you might be saying, "Hey, Dean, well, what about gold? Isn't gold something that was right there with this?" Oh yeah, eagles, or a gold eagle, are to be the value of $10 or 10 units and contain 247 grams of pure gold or 270 grams of standard gold. Half eagles were to be the value of $5 and contain 123 grams of pure gold or 135 grams of standard gold. So quarters, quarter of an eagle, I should say, should be the value of $2.50 and contain 61 grams of pure gold and 67 grams of standard gold. So you can see that there's dollars, half dollars, quarter dollars, so on and so forth. Those were coined or minted out of pure silver or some form of it. And the bigger denominations were to be minted out of gold. And so before we ever had these paper notes, these the Federal Reserve note that they so unlawfully call it, we actually had gold and silver that was our currency. So back in the 1790s, the Coinage Act. So don't forget that. That is what's called lawful money. And that was the currency of our country for the first 80 years of our country's existence. And in the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, it actually says the Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and fix the standards of weights and measures. No state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coins, a tender in payment of debt, and emit bills of credit. That is very specific language. Emit bills of credit means to issue promissory notes or demand notes and use them as currency. So nobody could arbitrarily come out and on a piece of paper, make some sort of demand or promissory note and use that as currency in exchange for the gold and silver that Congress had the power to coin and regulate. Okay, by linking the state's money to gold and silver, this links the state's and the nation's economy to gold and silver. It also prevented the banking institutions from loaning out to the public more money than it actually had in its vaults, basically preventing what we now know today as fractional reserve lending, and where banks can lend to its fractional reserve lending is where banks can lend to its customers up to 10 times what it actually has in deposits. So being able to link the state or the nation's money to gold and silver prevented that from happening. And I'll do another show in the future about fractional reserve lending and how that's a detriment to our country and creates things out of nothing, which makes no sense. So all this creates a monetary system based on hard assets such as gold and silver, a commodity that, like I said, one can taste, touch, see, smell, and have such system regulated by Congress and having that power distributed amongst the people, not private institutions or in the hands of a few, but spread out to everybody. So when we first kicked this country off, that's the way it was with our money and our currency and so on and so forth. So now let's kind of jump into the first two early central banks. And these were very short-lived. The first central bank was established in 1791, known as the First Bank of the United States, at the protest of Thomas Jefferson, among others, as its creation and existence being unconstitutional. In 1811, James Madison revoked its charter, so that didn't last very long. The second central bank was established in 1816 at the protest of Andrew Jackson, who hated the idea of private banks controlling America's money. Its charter was revoked in 1833 by Andrew Jackson, and funny food for thought or fact of the day, Andrew Jackson's tombstone reads, "I beat the banks." I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, the beginning of paper money. So if our country's built on, or our country's lawful money, quote unquote, is coined out of gold and silver, then how did we get these paper, pieces of paper that have certain denominations and we find in our wallets today? So let's dive right into that. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln issued the greenback in an effort to finance the Civil War. The U.S. Treasury took many gold and silver coins from the population and issued the country's first paper currency in both dollars and cents. Virtually all money in America became paper around this time, but according to the U.S. Constitution, in order for paper money to have a value, it must be legally binding, meaning it must be a legally binding document or contract. Therefore, its wording is very, very critical. So on the first paper dollars, you'll find the language, quote, promise to pay the bearer of X amount of dollars, let's call that $10, promise to pay the bearer $10, and below that, I should say, end quote, and below that, you'll find the following, quote, payable at the Treasury of the United States, end quote. So basically, the Treasury's note is not money, but a promissory note to pay the bearer real money redeemable at the U.S. Treasury in Washington, D.C., to which you would actually have to physically travel to in order to redeem your $10 bill or your $5 bill for 10 $1 silver coins or one gold eagle. And, as far as we can already start to see that this was not legal money according to the Constitution and according to the Coinage Act. So this greenback, it was already, you can already start to see the development of an unconstitutional thing coming down the pike. So this was a loan or a note that wasn't backed by anything but a promise to pay the bearer the face value of that note in gold or silver coins when presented to the Treasury in D.C. When this paper money began to be circulated in lieu of gold or silver coins, the value of the dollar absolutely tanked, and continued the free fall all the way through 1866 after the war ended. And it was after the Civil War that the U.S. began minting gold and silver coins again. Go figure. So this was a finance effort to finance the Civil War. And, this greenback was issued. Gold and silver was collected from the citizens. They were replaced with paper money. And it absolutely killed the value of the dollar. Okay, so here we go. After the war, we began minting our coins again, and the value of the dollar began increasing once again, and the spending power of the dollar increased along with it. However, all the while, the U.S. Treasury continued issuing paper money as a promise to pay, with the exception of foreign imports and the interest on the national debt. You couldn't use this paper money to buy foreign goods, and you couldn't use it to pay off the national debt, which was owed to foreign countries. That helped finance the war, so on and so forth. Okay, so in the 1880s, the U.S. Treasury began issuing a new type of paper money called the silver certificate. The language on this note read as follows, quote, there has been deposited in the U.S. Treasury one silver dollar payable to the bearer on demand, end quote. So that $1, that paper $1, was backed by one silver coin in the U.S. Treasury, as stated in the language on that note. Okay, at the same time, many states had banks who also issued banknotes, which were identified as valid currency by other states. So there was one state that had one bank, and then they recognized a different state's state bank, and they were each printing off their own paper money, and they would recognize each other's from state to state paper money. And so now we're getting really liberal. We're getting borderline unconstitutional, and it's really getting away from lawful money. Okay, I want you guys to remember that lawful money. Lawful money plays into everything we're going to be talking about, from this all the way to cryptocurrencies. Lawful money. Okay, so the banks issued these notes. They were identified as valid currency, and they could be redeemed for real money, lawful money, when presented to these banks. These promissory notes were floating around at the same time as the treasury notes and the silver certificates. So everybody starts printing off these silver certificates, paper money, promissory notes, and it all read certain things about you can come collect lawful money at this place or that place. Okay, so let's get into the Federal Reserve System and the new American Central Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank, a non-government, privately owned bank, was created in 1814, and the bill was passed quietly on Christmas Eve by shady politicians who were bought and paid for by a group of rich bankers and businessmen. These bankers and businessmen had a covert and private meeting on Jekyll Island, a small island off the U.S. East Coast, where they drafted their plans to establish the U.S. Central Bank by including politicians and a future president in their plans. And when the Federal Reserve Bank, known today as the Fed, was established, they immediately began creating what's called the Federal Reserve Note. And if you pull out any piece of paper from your wallet, you'll see right on there, Federal Reserve Note. A new government-sanctioned currency. The language on the Federal Reserve Note read as follows, quote, "This note is receivable by all national and member banks and Federal Reserve banks for all taxes, customs, and other public dues. It is redeemable in gold on demand at the Treasury Department in the U.S. City of Washington, District of Columbia, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank." End quote. It literally said, this is redeemable for lawful money. So if something says it's redeemable for lawful money, it must not be lawful money in it of itself. Okay, so when they started printing off these pieces of paper, they did realize that this isn't lawful money, and you can bring this and we can cash it in for lawful money at one of our member banks. Hence, the Federal Reserve Note can be redeemable for lawful money. It can't be lawful money in and of itself. It's only redeemable at one of its member banks. Okay, I wanted to stress that point. Today, the Fed is still privately owned, and against popular opinion or false pretenses, the Fed is not, I repeat, it is not a government entity. The Federal Reserve is not a government entity. The Federal Reserve Bank is as Federal Express. And, I want you guys to all know that, man, when you hear about the Federal Reserve controlling our nation's monetary policy, interest rates, they're controlling the money supply, things like that. You might as well look at it as Bank of America or not Washington Mutual, they're gone. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, your local credit union. These are all private institutions, and it's the Fed is no different than one of those private institutions controlling our entire nation's monetary system. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You can do a little more research on that. And remember that, any privately owned business has a privately held agenda, and that's no different here, okay? So let's keep going here. I don't want to get too hung up on my own bitterness of these institutions, but we're going to keep going in the eradication of gold and silver as money. Okay, in 1932, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, demonetized gold. It ended the production of gold coins, silver coins, and silver certificate dollars. It was done to stimulate the economy, as he put it, and allowed the Fed to begin issuing Federal Reserve notes that are no longer redeemable for lawful money at the Fed or any of its member banks. With this restriction lifted, a rapid expansion of the money supply, and it led to a massive expansion of the money supply, and the dollar would begin being devalued in a way which it would never recover, even to this day. Since 1932, we've seen the dollar plummet, and it keeps going lower and lower and lower. And a lot of people will talk about inflation, how the cost of goods has gotten more and more expensive over the years, and they will use things like, look at the gallon of gasoline today versus 25 years ago, or look at the value, or look at the cost of a stamp that today we pay, like 42 or 45 cents a stamp or something like that, and 25 years ago it was a lot less. Okay, that particular stamp didn't just go up in cost. That particular dollar that it took to buy that stamp just went that far down in value. Okay, so don't let people fool you when it comes to inflation. and the cost of goods. The cost of a gallon of milk is the same as the cost of a gallon of milk back in the 50s. It's just that those dollars that it took to buy that gallon of milk are worth a whole lot less today. Okay, so anyway, let's keep moving forward. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1945. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which basically priced the world's commodities in the denomination of dollars. The agreement gave the U.S. a significant economic advantage over other countries, but was made under the condition that all dollars would be redeemable at any time for gold at a consistent $35 an ounce. The U.S. promised not to print very much money, but this was on the honor system, basically a handshake, and the U.S. refused to allow any audits of its monitoring of its printing presses. So, we made these agreements with the rest of the world as long as the dollar could be the reserve currency in which every other commodity would be based on, and the rest of the world would give us their dollars in exchange for housing the gold and holding onto the gold and converting any of those dollars at any time at a consistent $35 an ounce. Now, today, I would love to buy gold at $35 an ounce, but that wouldn't happen. I think gold's trading somewhere $1,200, $1,300 an ounce, something along those lines. But we made this agreement with the rest of the world, the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1945. We promised the whole world, hey, yeah, let us have the world's reserve currency. And they all agreed, but, let's just keep going. So anyway, let's move on to JFK and silver certificates. In 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Executive Order 11110, reauthorizing the production of silver-backed certificates and silver dollars. Shortly after this executive order was signed, mysteriously, JFK was assassinated, and his successor, LBJ, did not share his economic vision. Therefore, the executive order was not carried out. Such a bummer. JFK tried so hard to get our country back on track and get our monetary system back in track, but the people that controlled the Federal Reserve, they knew that they were going to have a hard time controlling things if they weren't in control of the money. So anyway, they put a bullet in JFK's head and carried on as usual. In the 1970s, the Vietnam War was obviously costing the U.S. more money than it had in gold, and it was clear that we were printing far more paper money than what the U.S. promised other countries. And in response, these countries began asking for their gold back. This triggered a rapid decline in the value of the dollar. This situation intensified when France attempted to withdraw its gold from the U.S., and Richard Nixon, the president at the time, refused to furnish the gold. He then announced in a public statement in August of 1971 that the quote, speculators, end quote, were the cause of the rapid decline of the dollar. And in order to, quote, defend the dollar from speculators, end quote, he would temporarily suspend the ability to redeem the dollar for gold or other reserve assets. This was obviously not, I repeat, this was not a temporary suspension, but a permanent default. And for all the countries who entrusted their gold to the U.S., this was outright theft. In 1973, Nixon asked the King of Saudi Arabia at the time to only accept dollars in exchange for their oil and to invest any of their excess profits in U.S.-backed treasury bonds, notes, and bills. In return, the U.S. promised military protection of their oil fields, and the same offer was extended to all of the world's other key oil-producing countries. And by 1975, every member of OPEC agreed to only sell their oil in dollars. Okay, so from this point going forward, every oil-producing country was forced to keep a consistent supply of Federal Reserve paper. In order to keep this Federal Reserve paper, that other countries that purchased oil or that imported oil from these oil-producing countries were forced to ship their goods and services to the U.S., who would pay for these goods and services with Federal Reserve paper, and everything that the U.S. needed would come in, and all this paper would go out. And they would take the Federal Reserve paper, approach the Saudis or any other oil-producing nation in this OPEC agreement and buy oil in U.S. dollars. Okay, so this is the birth of the petrodollar. So if you've ever heard the term petrodollar, that's exactly what this is. We can no longer say gold or silver or lawful money backs our currency. It is only backed by oil and by the fact that every country on planet Earth needs to purchase oil from the countries who produce oil in US dollars. So let's just say, we're talking the people over in Switzerland, the Swiss franc. I think it's the Swiss franc. Anyway, if they wanted to buy oil over there in Switzerland, they would need to take their currency, exchange it into dollars, take those dollars, go down to Saudi Arabia, buy their oil in US dollars, and the Saudis would take it. They would then reinvest any profits into treasury notes, United States denominated treasury notes, treasury bills, so on and so forth. Okay, that's how we as a country have been able to experience such a powerful currency and been able to maintain such prosperity, is because the rest of the world is forced to buy oil, which every developing country needs, in the denomination of dollars, U.S. Federal Reserve notes or paper. Okay. So the birth of the petrodollar. Now, the threat to the petrodollar. In November of 2000, and I'm going to take you back to I'm sure pretty much all of us that are my age, or, all the people that I know and work with who are pretty much over the age of, 30, maybe 30 something, early 30s. You'll remember this all. But in November of 2000, Iraq began selling its oil in euros, not dollars. That we probably didn't know. But this, I promise you will know, and you will recognize. This was a slap in the face of the U.S. and would not be tolerated. So with the help of the United States mainstream media, the U.S. military began building up its propaganda campaign, stating that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was planning on using them. And in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, and once they had control, they immediately switched the sales of oil back to the dollar from the euro. Okay, after the Iraqi oil returned to the international market in the sale of dollars, Libyan President Gaddafi began assembling a bloc of African countries who would agree to no longer sell their oil in dollars, but create a gold-based currency called the dinar, in which they would sell their oil. And in 2011, the U.S. and NATO forces destabilized the Libyan region, toppled the Libyan government, and took control of the region. The U.S. armed rebels assassinated Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan central bank. Okay, so let's look at this. In 2000, we went in, took over Iraq, all in the name of weapons of mass destruction, which we know they never found, and assassinated Saddam Hussein, which he was also known as the Butcher of Baghdad. He wasn't the greatest guy in the world. Guy was a pretty disgusting person, from what we know, according to mainstream media and some other news coming out of Iraq back then. But there's no coincidence. This guy was going to sell. He started selling the Iraqi oil in euros, and trying to remove the nation, or remove our nation's monetary system as the currency in which that oil was traded. If we don't have oil supporting the value of our dollar, we have nothing supporting the value of our dollar. So the minute that the petrodollar is taken out from underneath us as a country, we're going to have some problems. Okay, this also tried to happen, this also transpired with Gaddafi in Libya. And what did we do? Oh my gosh, the most disgusting thing I've ever seen on TV is when Hillary Clinton is getting ready to have an interview and she says, we came, we saw, and he died. So cavalier, so clapping her hands with a giant smile on her face. And to know that was all about oil. That was nothing more than, don't get me wrong, Gaddafi was not a great guy. I'm not sitting here defending that. But what I am defending is the fact that he was trying to remove the dictatorship of the United States and having all of that country's natural resource sold in a currency that had nothing to do with their country. Libya had nothing to do with the United States dollar, other than the fact that they were told that they had to sell their oil in the to the rest of the world, basically in denominations of the U.S. dollar. So anyway, you can start to see how all this revolves around oil and money. Okay, they went in immediately after Gaddafi was assassinated in cold blood and set up the Libyan Central Bank. Okay, Iran. Oh boy, Iran has been actively campaigning to pull all of its oil sales off the dollar, and in 2012 it began reaching agreements to sell its oil in gold. Immediately, the U.S. began campaigning with mainstream media assistance to build international support and military strike against Iran, under the pretenses of stopping Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, the U.S. and Iran's international opposition has imposed sanctions against Iran, which has been openly admitted to being aimed at crippling and collapsing the Iranian economy. This doesn't even take into consideration the inclusion of Turkey, Syria, Russia, and China's recent announcement to the purchase of oil from countries like Russia, Syria, and Iran in the denomination of gold or in the Chinese yuan. For decades, countries have been trying to obtain autonomy by escaping the petrodollar, or the global, quote, megadebt country, as the rest of the world refers to us. No country has been successful in removing the dollar from the world reserve currency. Any country that has attempted has had terrible things happen to them, while the mainstream media and the U.S. government has been painting a very different picture as to what's happening to said countries, i.e., Iraq, Hussein, Libya, Gaddafi, Iran, Russia, you name it. So, one assumption that we can start making, or an inference, I should say, that we can start drawing, is that if there's a country and a president of such country that our mainstream media starts pointing fingers at and starts saying, this country is doing this and that, and it's awful and blah, 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 you probably can bet that it has something to do with oil. If you dig a little bit deeper and scratch just farther enough underneath the surface, you'll see that it's not all that it's cracked up to be. Okay, so that's where I'm going to end this podcast. That is the history of the dollar, taking you from lawful money, the Coinage Act, 1792, all the way to the present day. So anyway, thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for episode 2, where we're going to go over the cryptocurrency mania, the do's, the don'ts, the caution, all that other good stuff, answering all the questions. I just felt like this is a very important thing to understand and to know before we dive into cryptocurrencies, because without understanding our past, you will not be able to thoroughly understand our future. Thank you so much for listening. I love you all. I am so grateful to have such a great audience, such as you guys. Take care, God bless, and till we meet again.